My daughter-in-law dropped off a jar of homemade peach preserves on my front porch last Tuesday. No knock, no note, just a handwritten tag, made with love for you, Mom. I stood in my doorway holding that jar longer than I probably should have. My neighbor Carol saw the look on my face and asked if I was okay. I didn't know how to explain it. How do you explain that a jar of peach preserves made you feel grateful and terrified at the same time? My daughter-in-law, Brianna, my son Daniel's wife, hadn't spoken a single word to me in almost 2 years. Not at Thanksgiving, not at Christmas, not when I spent 4 days alone in the hospital after hip surgery. Nothing. And now, out of nowhere, a jar of preserves with the words made with love. I'm 63. I taught high school English for 31 years. I know when something doesn't fit the plot. I raised Daniel alone after his father left when he was 9. I worked double shifts, drove him to debate practice, watched him graduate law school. He married Brianna 6 years ago, smart, beautiful, and cold toward me from almost the beginning. Small things at first, forgetting to include me in plans, talking over me at dinner. Then 2 years ago, after one Sunday dinner, everything shifted. Daniel stopped calling. Brianna stopped answering texts. My 4-year-old grandson Oliver vanished from my life like someone had drawn a curtain. I called, wrote letters, even drove to their house and rang the bell for 10 minutes while the lights stayed on inside and no one answered. I gave it time. 23 months of time. Then the jar appeared. That evening I opened it, smelled the peaches, and let myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe Brianna felt guilty, that maybe things were finding their way back. Carol came by to return a book, saw the jar, and asked to try some. She spread it on crackers, declared it the best preserves she'd tasted in 30 years, and we talked for 2 hours over sweet tea before she went home around 8. I went to bed feeling something close to hopeful for the first time in a long while. The next morning, Daniel called. First contact in 23 months. His voice was casual, too casual. Did you get the preserves Brianna left? He was checking. Did you try them? Something in the tightness of that question made the hair on my arms stand up. Not yet, I said, before I even knew why I was lying. There was a pause. Brief, but there. Oh, well, let me know what you think. She worked really hard on them. Took her all weekend. A few more vague sentences, then he said he had to get to a meeting and hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand feeling something colder than sadness. The seal on the jar had looked intact. Everything about it looked exactly right. But I kept hearing that pause. I called Carol to talk it through, and instead found her in trouble. Her voice was thin and strained, terrible stomach pain, pins and needles in her hands. I told her to call 911, told her I'd be there in 4 minutes, and stayed on the phone the whole drive. By the time I pulled into her driveway, the ambulance was already there. I rode with her to Mercy General, held her hand as her lips turned slightly gray, and made a decision. The moment the nurses wheeled her through the ER doors, I called 911 myself and reported a potential poisoning. I told them exactly what Carol had eaten, when, and where the jar was. I called the ER directly and asked them to run a talk screen immediately. Then I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours, drinking terrible coffee, calling my sister Patricia, but not Daniel. 2 detectives arrived around noon. I told them everything, the 23 months of silence, the jar appearing out of nowhere, Daniel's phone call, that pause. I told them I had a feeling I couldn't fully explain, but that I'd learned in 63 years to trust that feeling. They collected the jar and lid as evidence, photographed my porch and kitchen. Before leaving, Detective Reyes told me I'd done the right thing calling when I did. 48 hours later, the lab results came back, ethylene glycol, antifreeze, mixed into the preserves by what the toxicologist called a deliberate and knowledgeable hand. Enough to be lethal in the amount a person might reasonably eat, disguised by the sweetness of the peaches. Carol had eaten 3 crackers worth, enough to make her critically ill, not quite enough to kill her. I had eaten none. Surveillance footage showed Brianna's car pulling up to my curb at 6:47 a.m. Tuesday, 4 hours before I even woke up. She placed the jar and left in under 2 minutes. Daniel was arrested that Thursday morning. Detective Reyes called to tell me herself before I could hear it any other way. Sitting on the edge of my bed afterward, I felt something I still struggle to name, not quite relief, not quite grief. Something like the exhausted recognition of a story finally arriving at the sentence you already somehow knew was coming. They charged Daniel with attempted murder of both me, the intended target, and Carol, the unintended one. Brianna was charged separately. I later learned Daniel had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy on me, and had been quietly contesting a provision in my late mother's estate, money I'd always meant to leave him one day. Apparently he hadn't wanted to wait. The trial is still months away, and my attorney has advised me not to discuss details publicly. What I can say is that I've visited Carol every single day since. She spent 11 days in the hospital, her kidneys strained but recovered. She's home now, complaining loudly about the sodium in my soup, which tells me she's going to be fine. I've made changes since that morning. I rewrote my will entirely. Everything now goes to my niece in Colorado, a nursing student who once drove 8 hours without even calling first, just to sit with me after my hip surgery. I joined a support group for parents of estranged adult children, and for the first time in a long time, my situation didn't feel like a referendum on my worth as a mother. I also bought a doorbell camera. I sleep better now, which surprised me. People ask if I sensed something coming. I always say the same thing, I didn't know, but I knew something. I knew the jar was wrong before I could say why. I knew that pause on the phone meant something I didn't want it to mean. I knew that a person who shuts you out for 23 months doesn't reappear with something made with love without a reason. People don't become different people overnight, they simply become more fully themselves. I spent 31 years teaching students that every story has a moment where the reader knows something the narrator is still pretending not to know, that the most dangerous thing a character can do is ignore what doesn't fit. I should have trusted that lesson sooner in my own life. I'm trusting it now. Carol came over for tea last Sunday with her ridiculous fluffy dog, Biscuit, who knocked over my magazine rack without a shred of remorse. We laughed for 3 hours. At one point she looked at me and said, "You know, you saved my life." I told her I just called when I should have called. She said that's exactly what saving a life looks like, most people don't do it. I've thought about that a lot since, about all the times over the past 2 years I quietly absorbed something painful and told myself it wasn't that bad, that surely things would find their way back if I was just patient enough. Patience and paralysis can wear the same face for a long time before you can tell them apart. I don't regret loving my son. I don't regret 30 years spent building a life around his well-being. Love isn't foolish just because it isn't returned. But I believe now, more than I've ever believed anything, that love doesn't require you to stand still in a doorway holding something that might hurt you, just because the person who sent it shares your blood. Some gifts aren't gifts. Some silences aren't waiting, they're planning. And some mornings, the most important thing you will ever do is pick up the phone and tell the truth about what you're afraid of, before you've finished being afraid of it. I picked up that phone. Carol is home. I am here. That is enough for now.